Hey, Bruce, it's good to see you. It's been a few weeks since you were at our church, and I'm really excited that you're going to be a part of this conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting and informative to people. But tell me how you're doing. How you been?
I've been doing great. I just got back from overseas rescue operation, and I'm just a couple of days back, so I'm still in that twilight zone of jet lag, but I'm doing very, very well and enjoying the warm weather here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the same thing true here in Ohio. We've had in our part of Ohio one snow this year. And, of course, this is the year I went out and bought me a really nice brand new snowblower. And I've got to use it one time, but
I
I'm
did the
not
same
complaining.
exact thing. I bought a brand new snowblower, and I've used it one time also. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, yeah, buy an umbrella and you go into drought. That's the way it works.
Mhm.
Anyway, so you were at our church a few weeks ago and telling us some absolutely incredible things that you're doing that I really want the people watching this to understand and to hear what's going on. But first, let's back up and maybe give them a bit of a biography. So you and I met years ago, and you've been a part of ICA and then ICAL and USCAL. So we've interacted some over the last maybe 15 years. So when I met you as a church pastor. I met you and your wife in your church, and that's kind of all I knew you to be. But then later I learned that before and during pastoring, there was a lot of things going on in your life with the outdoors. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your life story in that chapter of your life?
Sure. Well, most of my life I've been involved in some kind of adventure. Even as a teenager, I was really involved in scuba diving, and I grew up in Titusville, Pennsylvania, landlocked, and would drive up to Erie, Pennsylvania to take scuba lessons at 16. I think I was the only person in my high school that did that, and ended up doing a lot of diving all over the place, and then I went into the military and got a lot of interesting skills in the military. And then when I was out, I got into the outdoor business of being a guide, eventually an adventurer and explorer. So those years took me from teaching all kinds of things like survival and rock climbing and uh, uh, a lot of wilderness travel, canoe trips into the north and wildlife photography trips, into the Canadian Rockies. And so those adventures were everything from trying to ski to the North Pole in 1981 with the Canadian North Pole team, which was a little bit on the crazy side. 1979, we did first ascents in the Arctic, and I was able to name some glaciers and mountains, and we were the first human beings to ever be there. And then after that, we got into doing a lot of just I would teach survival courses. I spent 4 winters going in and out of the Canadian Rockies, following wolf packs and really deep into there. And my second book, I'm actually working on the chapters of all my experiences with wolves right now, because I ended up in the middle of wolf packs and followed by wolf packs and sneaking in on wolves, and over those years, some pretty crazy stuff. And in that journey, I got involved in ministry. I was led to the Lord by a young guy, much younger than I was. He was just a really good preacher, and ended up spending some time with he and his family. And even though I had made a commitment in the Air Force to the Lord, I backslid pretty big time, and they gently led me back, and that's where I got involved in ministry. Uh, from there, I started
But let me
teaching
ask you,
Bible study.
let me
Yeah.
ask you some ages here. I'm curious. So, in the late 70s, when you're skiing up to the North Pole, or 1980s, when you're mountain climbing, about what age are you at that time?
I was 24 on my first Arctic expedition. I was 25 on the North Pole attempt, and then it was about 20 years old in the Air Force where I got involved in, all the outdoor stuff, all the skills I learned in the Air Force with mountaineering and rescue work and stuff like that.
Okay. And then at some point in time, you make a commitment to Christ. You start into ministry. You can pick up the story there, but how old were you when you felt that call?
I think I was around 29 when I really started to get serious about God, and into my early 30s. I started teaching a Bible study for the church I was going to. In fact, they asked me to start the Bible study at my home, and I lived in this log cabin. And the first week, nobody showed up, so I just taught to an empty house. I just opened my Bible and just taught. I did that for 6 weeks, and nobody showed up. And I thought, well, if nobody's going to show up, I'm just gonna speak, into the house, And so I just taught by myself. The seventh week, 25 people showed up to my Bible study, and it
Well,
was a
what
great
what
lesson
would
for
you
me to learn.
attribute that to? Like 25 people, you go from 0 to 25. I mean, that's an impossible percentage to try to calculate. But
I have no idea. I really don't know. I just was being faithful, and
wow.
I know they announced it in church, that I was having, and then uh, all these people started showing up. My house is completely packed, and so I was learning a lot. I was pretty young, learning a lot about the Bible, but learning how to teach and learning how to do these things. And so that just kept leading me deeper and deeper until where I became an associate pastor. Ended up traveling, doing a lot of missions work with the pastor into the ex-Soviet countries and then some other places. And that's really where I learned about human trafficking. Was in the early 90s. The KGB had become the new mafia, and so when I was traveling in those countries, seeing all these things, uh, I heard the local pastors talking about. I don't know if they used the word human trafficking, but they were talking about girls being sold, and these kind of things. And so I started investigating and teaching a lot, preaching in the church, doing visitations, learning things. Back then, the pastor and I would talk for hours about the apostolic, and uh, and back then in the '90s, there wasn't a whole lot of people that talked about that stuff. And then I think it was in 2000 I met John Kelly, and he didn't give me a whole lot of time until I mentioned something about we had been given a big property here in Pennsylvania, and he turned around and just stared at me for a while, and he asked me a couple of questions, and he invited me to become a member of the ICA. It was that quick.
And so I think that was maybe not long after that we met. I can't remember the exact time, but I'm guessing that would have been around 2006, 7, 8, something like that. And my assistant at that time, Ben Thompson, who was at church the other day, well, he still goes to our church and he's an elder now in our church. So he was with me, and we came over and visited you, talked about maybe starting a school of ministry there, which never
Yeah.
materialized at that point. But then there was a big segment, I don't know, from probably that time, which I'm thinking 2006, 7, 8 in that arena until last year. And so last year, we re-met with John Polis at his Shepherds, School of the Shepherds, which we just did this past weekend, by the way. Nikki and I
Yeah.
did that again this year. And
That's
so
awesome.
you and I met, and I started hearing things that you were doing that I had no idea that you were doing. And it was really stunning when I heard you speak. And I knew that you needed to come and share this with our people. And it took a while for us to work out the dates, but we were so honored to have you a couple of weeks back. And this is where we really want you to be able to share what's happening around the world with human trafficking, with what you're doing to assemble teams to go over to parts of the world and to help rescue children and especially the trafficked females. But the first question is, How did you get involved in that? How do you go from, like, from my perspective, a typical local church pastor living a nice life, and then all of a sudden you're traveling around the world with ex-military in a team assembled rescuing people. So could you take us on that journey?
Sure. Yeah, I think we were pretty successful in pastoring. We had started churches. I ended up with a network of churches worldwide, and but it never seemed like it was quite who I was, Mark. And even though it was successful, and I think I was an okay pastor. I don't think I was a great pastor. I was okay. The church grew really big because of the revival atmosphere that took place, and we were seeing a lot of people healed and set free, and it was just a great atmosphere. But I wasn't. I don't know if I was a really good pastor. Uh, and so I started doing a lot of work overseas. I started doing some pretty big crusades um, in Africa, and I ended up in Pakistan in 2009, uh, which is really interesting. Just a quick story on that is I was praying one day about the network because it was getting pretty big, and I'm relational. I love to build relationships, and I felt like, well, maybe this is getting too big. We had about a dozen churches that were connected to a lot of other churches, and to me that seemed really big. And I was praying, and I heard the Lord say, "Are you willing to take your hand off and let this thing grow?" And all I did was say, "Yes, Lord." And literally that next week or two, I started getting emails and phone calls from all over the world. People found my website, which was so obscure I couldn't even find my own website, and they were finding the website and calling me. And so I created a vetting process, to try to figure out who these people were. They were from all over Africa and all over Asia, um, South America. It just exploded just that quickly, just because I said yes, Lord. And I didn't really know how to handle that. John Kelly uh, gave me a lot of advice in that journey, and then so I kind of settled down to where we had a good group of people that I felt good about. But one of the guys was from Pakistan, and so I took a year and a half to get to know him before I accepted his offer to come to Pakistan. That was in 2009 that I went over to Pakistan, and he had arranged for a pretty good size, they call them festivals instead of crusades, pretty good sized festival and a pastor's conference. And it was my real first experience in that part of the world. And I was stunned at the response. Every hand went up for salvation. There was miracles, healings. I literally watched people, I watched tumors disappear and eyes, blind eyes open. And it was pretty remarkable. It was life changing for me. But during that time, they also were talking about these slave kids. And so they took me out and showed me where some of these places were. And I literally stood in one place and could see hundreds of slaves.
Mhm.
And I was stunned. And so before I left, I had told the host, I said, I'm going to start rescuing people out of slavery. And he looked at me, and he was one of the top leaders of Christian leaders of Pakistan. He looked at me, goes, "No, this is impossible. Nobody can do this. They'll kill you." And I said, "No, we're going to do it." I felt stirred of the Lord to do it. He
So
argued with me.
were these the brick yards, where they're using the slave labor in the mud to make these bricks?
These were some brick kilns and also some rope factories and some other small type of factories. And so he argued with me, and I said, "We're going to do it." And uh, the night of the first crusade, I think it was, or the second night, we rescued some children that had come and they were sitting on the front row. I talk about it in my book in detail. And he fought me on it. He goes, "No, we can't do this." He was afraid. But I showed him that we could do this, and I showed him how to do this. And he became one of the great champions of his nation
Hmm.
in doing this until there was so many death attempts on him, stab, shot, all kinds of stuff that he had to leave the country.
Okay,
But
let me
that's
ask
how
you
we
in detail exactly what it is that you told him as a way in which you could save these children. So I get the picture. They come to the crusade service. They're sitting up front. They're obviously probably dressed in ways that identified them as slaves. And so you're going to rescue them how? What did you say to him to say, here's the strategy that we can implement that can get this done, maybe that he hadn't thought of before?
Well, it was a little bit of a faith journey on my part. I said that without really knowing what I was doing. And
Yeah.
so I kind of started learning as I went. And because there was nobody back in those days, now there's thousands of organizations out there. I could not find anybody in those years that that were doing this. So I had to learn this on my own.
Mhm.
I we searched, I couldn't find, there was no manual, on this, slave rescuing 101. And
Mhm.
so, we went in and started paying off debts. Well, that didn't work because those slave owners took that money and went and bought kids out of the slums and replaced the ones we took.
Mhm.
So then we started reducing that to where I was paying 50 cents on the dollar and then down to 10 cents on the dollar because we were told by a government official, make sure that some money exchanges hands. Um, for whatever reason, they, accused me of stealing from them or whatever.
Mhm.
And so we would go in and I would confront the slave owners. We would get these families out and they would say they owe $1,500. Well, we put $50 down, and walk out with them and they'd be screaming and yelling at us and all these things to where eventually over the years, I was 7 years of working in and out of Pakistan. Eventually, we were doing stuff like going into places. The slave owner wasn't there. We'd load up as many slaves as we could in as many vehicles, and we just take off and make them disappear. And that resulted in a lot of contracts on my life and death attempts on me and
Okay.
all that stuff.
Couple questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, where do these children go exactly when you make them disappear? Are they given to legitimate Christian orphanages? Are they taken to other countries? What happens, especially to the children, whenever they're rescued?
Yeah, you can't get them out of those countries, even where I just was this last week. You can't get them out, uh, of these areas. So we have to find places. So we created an underground railroad type of scenario where these families would go to one pastor, then another pastor, or they would go
Okay.
to a business person, or even in some cases a politician who is very favorable to this, and they would take them through a journey to some village, way far away from where we rescued them.
Okay.
So we had a pretty elaborate setup on how to do this.
Yeah, and network the church, because you were talking about your apostolic network. This is a network. It's just a little bit different,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a network of churches and leaders that you were able to use to get these young people into other homes where they could live more normal lives. The second question I had was, what is the prevailing attitude of the culture towards slavery? We know here in the United States, for instance, you're appalled by the thought of slavery, even in the past tense of 200 years ago, let alone today, present tense. But evidently in these cultures, what, it's just accepted as a form of employment, perhaps?
Yeah, there's over 40 million people in modern slavery, so there's slavery in every nation in the world now, and in some places, as in the Middle East and throughout Asia, it's not legal, but it's accepted. And so, like where I just was, you can go into a cafe or a restaurant or a hotel. It is very common you can find some young Christian children. When I say Christian, they'd be cultural Christians, not necessarily understanding the dimensions of being born again and so on.
Mhm.
But you can find them in there working, and they do labor during the day and often being abused by men at night. Uh, and nobody really speaks up. It's just kind of accepted in those cultures. Uh, Now in Pakistan, the Christian population is very subjugated. We've seen a lot of death over there. We've some of our pastors have been killed. Uh, in one instance, there was a Christian couple that touched a piece of their holy book, and they were dragged across the vents of a furnace and burned alive. And my wife and I and team stood at that very place with some government officials, to protest that. And so the and I make this statement in my book: if slavery were to end in some of these places, it would affect the economy because it's so prevalent. Especially like in India, it's estimated there's 17 million people in some form of, slavery, whether it's sex trafficking or, debt bondage or outright slavery. Uh, in Pakistan, it's in the millions, those places. So it's just very, very accepted in the cultures.